What happened in Geneva was not diplomacy in the normal sense of the word. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a bad day at the table. It was the visible arrival of a pattern that has been building for years. When global public debt has already crossed $100 trillion, when the Strait of Hormuz still carries around 1/5 of the world's oil and petroleum product consumption, and when the IAEA says Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched up to 60% stood at 440, 9 kilograms before last year's strikes, you're not looking at a routine dispute. You're looking at a pressure system. And Geneva was the moment that system stopped pretending to be anything else. That is the first thing most coverage got wrong. The meeting in Geneva was framed as another round of talks, another attempt at de-escalation, another diplomatic opening. But Reuters reported that the talks ended without a deal, even as Oman described significant progress, and both sides agreed to continue with technical-level discussions in Vienna. In other words, the meeting did not produce peace. It produced continuation under pressure. That matters, because when diplomacy keeps moving but the core disputes stay untouched, you are not watching reconciliation. You are watching compression. And the pressure surrounding those talks was not subtle. Reuters reported that Trump was still openly warning that sometimes you have to use force, while the U.S. had amassed major military assets in the region, including 2 aircraft carrier groups. AP described the Geneva round as taking place under the shadow of a massive American military buildup in the Middle East. So let's be honest, those talks were not floating in neutral air. They were taking place inside a coercive frame. Once you understand that, Geneva stops looking confusing. It starts looking familiar. Because history has a habit of repeating one brutal sequence. First, a state builds leverage. Then it expands that leverage until it starts changing the balance around it. Then the dominant powers decide the ambiguity has gone too far. Then comes the offer, not a deal between equals. An off-ramp, a controlled surrender. Give up enough of your leverage, and you may buy time, relief, recognition, maybe survival. Refuse, and the next layer of pressure arrives. That is the machine. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. And the terrifying part is that the machine almost always sounds reasonable in its final phase. That is how it works. The language becomes technical. Verification, compliance, inspectors, timetables, enrichment limits, export of stockpiles, confidence-building measures. But beneath that clean vocabulary is something much older, the forced narrowing of another state's choices. If you want proof, start with Versailles. Before the treaty, there was a setup. Germany had unified late, industrialized fast, and entered Europe as a rising power in an old and nervous order. It believed that industrial strength and military power could force a new continental arrangement. That was the illusion of leverage. Power mistaken for insulation. Then came expansion. World War I was not just a war of trenches and alliances. It was also Germany's attempt to convert strategic strength into a new political map. But expansion is the dangerous phase because a state starts believing its momentum is self-protecting. It assumes capacity is enough. It assumes speed will beat coordination. It assumes the old order is weaker than it really is. Then came crisis. At the Paris Peace Conference, the defeated Central Powers were excluded. Germany was not shaping the settlement as an equal. It was being positioned to receive one. That detail matters. Because by the time a crisis reaches the conference table, the real negotiation is often already over. The question is no longer what is fair. The question is who gets to write the terms. Then came the outcome. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to surrender about 10% of its pre-war European territory and all of its overseas possessions, except Article 231, and face reparations, later fixed at 132 billion gold Reichsmarks. That was not peace among equals. That was pressure converted into structure. The target was left with humiliation, limits, and a future defined by terms it did not control. And that is the point. The emotional residue of the system is almost always the same: resentment after compression. Then look at Cuba in 1962. Again, the pattern is clear. The setup came after the Bay of Pigs, and after Cuba became both a Soviet asset and a Soviet opportunity. Cuba offered geography. The Soviet Union saw a chance to move pressure closer to the United States. That is how Stage 1 always works. Insecurity plus strategic location. Then came expansion. Soviet missiles were placed in Cuba to alter the strategic balance. Not symbolically, physically. That is what leverage becomes in Stage 2. A state or alliance tries to create facts that force the other side to negotiate on worse terms than before. Then came crisis. The U.S. discovered the missile sites. Kennedy rejected passivity, ordered a naval quarantine on October 22nd, demanded dismantlement, and U.S. forces soon moved to DEFCON 2 as the crisis escalated toward potential war. Once again, the dominant power narrowed the menu and backed the narrowing with overwhelming force. And then came the outcome. The missiles were removed from Cuba. The United States pledged publicly not to invade the island. Privately, Robert Kennedy signaled that U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey would also be removed, though not as part of the public bargain. That is one of the purest examples of how this machine operates at its highest level: public firmness, private calibration, and the forced unwinding of leverage once the crisis matures. Now look at Libya in 2003. This case matters because it is structurally closer to Iran than most people want to admit. The setup was years of sanctions, isolation, and a regime that believed unconventional capabilities could create deterrence and bargaining power. Libya was weaker than its adversaries, so it reached for strategic programs to compensate. Then came expansion. Libya pursued weapons programs and ballistic missile capabilities while remaining at odds with the West. It believed the lever could buy security. But stage 2 only works while the state still thinks its lever will raise its value faster than it raises the risk of preemption. Then came crisis. On December 19, 2003, President George W. Bush announced that Muammar Gaddafi had committed to disclose and dismantle Libya's weapons of mass destruction programs and to allow inspectors in immediately and unconditionally. Bush was explicit about the larger lesson. Regimes that pursued such weapons would face isolation and consequences, while those that abandoned them could find an open path to better relations. That was not just diplomacy, that was the machine speaking in plain language. Now bring that exact pattern to Iran, and Geneva becomes coldly understandable. The setup for Iran was built over decades. Iran's geography alone gives it systemic relevance. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says flows through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 and the first quarter of 2025 accounted for more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption, with around 1/5 of global LNG trade also passing through that choke point. Iran does not sit beside a local waterway. It sits beside a valve in the world economy. That is stage 1, setup, check. Then Tehran added layered leverage. Missiles, regional partners. A nuclear program defended not only as strategy, but as sovereign right. That framing matters. The most durable leverage is always the kind a state can present as lawful, defensive, and nationally dignified. Iran did not simply build capability, it built a justification for capability. Then came expansion. Reuters and AP both reported that the IAEA assessed Iran's stockpile of uranium enriched up to 60% at 440. 9 kilograms before the June 2025 strikes, enough, if enriched further, for around 10 nuclear weapons by the agency's yardstick. Iran denies seeking a bomb, but the structural point is not intent. The structural point is tempo. A stockpile like that changes time itself. It compresses negotiation. It raises the cost of delay. It turns abstract diplomacy into deadline diplomacy. Expansion. Verified. Then came crisis. After Israeli and U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities last June, the IAEA reported that it could not verify whether Iran had suspended all uranium enrichment or determined the size and location of its enriched uranium stockpile. Reuters reported that the agency called immediate verification indispensable and urgent, and pointed specifically to Isfahan, where highly enriched uranium had reportedly been stored in a tunnel complex. That is not routine inspection language. That is the language of a system that believes ambiguity has become dangerous. Crisis. Check. And then came Geneva. Reuters reported that the talks in Geneva ended with no deal, even though Oman said significant progress had been made and Vienna technical talks were scheduled to follow. That alone tells you everything. When the atmosphere is described as positive, but the hardest issues remain unresolved, it means the structure is still doing the real work. The room is active, but the corridor is narrow. Now focus on what Washington was actually demanding. Reuters reported that the Trump administration wanted Iran to give up all uranium enrichment. The same Reuters reporting said Washington also insisted Iran's ballistic missile program and support for armed groups in the region be part of negotiations. AP reported the same basic objective: stop enrichment, roll back long-range missile capacity, and restrain regional projection. That is not a routine adjustment package. That is a redesign of leverage itself. And what was Iran asking for? Reuters reported that Tehran wanted sanctions, relief, and recognition of its right to peaceful enrichment. It also reported that Iran was willing to consider concessions, including sending half of its most highly enriched uranium abroad, diluting the rest, and joining a regional enrichment consortium, but only in return for sanctions relief and recognition of its enrichment rights. Read that carefully. Even flexibility from Tehran was already being expressed in the language of managed rollback. That is why Geneva mattered so much. Not because a final deal was reached. It was not. Not because trust suddenly appeared. It did not. Geneva mattered because the shape of the offer became visible, and the shape of the offer was this: surrender enough hard leverage that the pressure system can relax without ever having to trust you. That is the real story. Not peace, not breakthrough. Not a new chapter. A narrowing. A strategic narrowing. A state that spent years building bargaining power is now being told that the price of relief is the dismantling of the very things that made it hard to coerce in the first place. That is why so many people felt that something about Geneva seemed off. The word sounded diplomatic. The structure did not. Oman spoke of progress. Iran spoke of serious talks. U.S. officials spoke of a possible path. But underneath that polished language was the same old grammar history uses again and again. Comply, reduce, open, verify, surrender, normalize. And once you hear that grammar clearly, the pattern locks into place. Setup. Iran's geography, strategic relevance, sanctions endurance, nuclear infrastructure. Check. Expansion. Stockpiles, enrichment, missile leverage, regional reach. Verified. Crisis, strikes, military buildup, urgent IAEA demands, unverified material, pressure from every side. Undeniable. Outcome. A tightly managed diplomatic corridor in which Tehran is being pushed to trade capability for breathing room. Check again. And this is where audience after audience gets trapped by the same comforting lie. This time is different. No, it isn't. People said modern institutions would tame this logic. They didn't. People said economic integration would make coercive bargaining obsolete. It didn't. People said nuclear age risk would force everyone into rational equilibrium. It didn't. People said technology, surveillance, and global governance would civilize the old power struggle. They didn't. They digitized it. They bureaucratized it. They wrapped it in legal language. But they did not change the mechanism. Versailles had clauses. Cuba had quarantine lines. Libya had inspectors. Geneva has sanctions relief formulas, enrichment disputes, technical meetings, and military shadow. Same machine, new software. Now, does that mean war is guaranteed? No, and saying that would be sloppy. But it does mean the field of outcomes is narrowing. It means Tehran is no longer negotiating in a wide-open strategic environment. It is negotiating in a corridor shaped by military force, inspection pressure, energy risk, and the fear of what happens if the current ambiguity survives one round too many. That is why the most important question is not whether Iran still has cards. Of course it does. Hormuz is a card. Regional escalation is a card. Oil shock is a card. National pride is a card. Domestic endurance is a card. But having cards is not the same as controlling the table. And right now, Washington still controls much of the sanctions architecture, much of the escalation tempo, and much of the diplomatic framing through which the burden of proof falls on Tehran. That asymmetry is the real revelation. The offer in Geneva was not merely about uranium percentages or inspector access. It was about control over uncertainty. The United States and its partners are trying to reduce Iran from a state with dangerous ambiguity to a state with manageable limits. And Iran is trying to preserve enough ambiguity to remain sovereign, relevant, and difficult to corner. That is the clash. Everything else is packaging. So what should the viewer take from this? Stop watching these events as isolated headlines. Stop treating each round of talks like a separate episode. Watch the structure instead. Watch choke points. Watch stockpiles. Watch whether the language shifts from behavior to capability. Watch when demands stop asking a state to change what it does and start asking it to give up what it has. That is the moment negotiation becomes re-engineering. And that is exactly what Geneva revealed. Not the end of the story, the stage of the story. The stage where a pressure system stops arguing about intentions and starts moving toward mechanism. The stage where the room still looks diplomatic, but the architecture has already turned coercive. The stage where history becomes less random and more bounded. That is the warning. Not that everything explodes tomorrow, not that a deal is impossible. The warning is more serious than that. The warning is that once a system reaches this point, surprises become less important than structures. The names may change. The spokesman may change. The location may change from Paris to Geneva to Vienna to Muscat. But the machine stays recognizable. And if you still think technology, optimism, or modern exceptionalism will somehow save the world from the consequences of this pattern, look again. Global public debt is still rising. Energy choke points still matter. Military force still shadows diplomacy. Nuclear files still become regime questions. The machine did not disappear. It adapted. So understand the machine before the next round begins. Because once you see the pattern, Geneva stops looking like a mystery. It starts looking like a warning. And the people who get blindsided by history are usually not the people who never saw the facts. They are the people who saw every fact in front of them and still failed to recognize the structure connecting them.